Hello everybody, here we are today talking about just a few things from the first round of the NHL Draft from last night. But before we get started with it, please make sure to subscribe if you're new to me or hockey, whatever the case may be. That being said, let's get on into it. So we'll kick it off by, of course, saying what we always say regarding the draft. I am not an expert. I don't cover the draft as much as I should, mainly because you can have a first overall pick become a bad player. You can have a guy that was taken in the third, fourth, fifth round, whatever, become a really good NHL player. So for me, it's more about what they become, not what they are kind of viewed as in the moment. But still, there are a lot of things to talk about, and we're going to be talking about just a few things early on in the draft, especially with, of course, the fact Macklin Celebrini was the first overall pick. Now, this isn't that surprising. This felt like a consensus first overall pick. He was a kid that's from the Bay Area. The Sharks, of course, getting to have the first overall pick. The first time they ever had the first overall pick, I do believe, and they go out and get him. This is something that feels like it could be a great thing for the Sharks. They haven't made the playoffs in the past 5 seasons. This year especially was not a great year. They didn't do a lot of things very well. In fact, many things they did very, very poorly, very unwell, if you will. But I think a large part of it was the fact that they had a lot of runs that just were atrocious, and then some periods where they actually played decent hockey enough to go 8-7 in a 15-game run. But they still need a lot of help as they are trying to get back to the postseason and be the team they used to be. And by getting Celebrini, they might just go out there and do that a little bit faster. Now, San Jose is not going to go and become a playoff team by next year. But just like a lot of these other teams that are young, that are in the middle of a rebuild, they've got some younger players that are getting NHL opportunities, some guys that have already seen decent amount of NHL action, and now will be getting Celebrini. And who knows, maybe it could be somebody that makes a first-year impact or whatever you want to say. With this being such a fun pick and talking about how he could help the Sharks become what they used to be, a team that won division titles, that won the President's Trophy, and was a team that was in the mix of going on deep runs and even made it to the Stanley Cup final, it would be a very cool storyline to see first overall pick for the team for the first time, being able to help them win their first title potentially. Now, again, it's probably in the long-term future at the moment, but things are looking up for the Sharks, and I'm hoping their fans go out there and support them again for this season. And then another thing we're going to be talking about is the fact that Chicago Blackhawks selected Artem Levshinov with the second overall pick. This is fun. Again, I know early in the draft that seems a little bit ironic to say, but we are seeing a blue line for the Chicago Blackhawks that could be very enticing in the future. You have Kevin Korchinski that just got done with his rookie season. He is looking to have maybe a good second year and build off what he did in year one. You have guys like Ethan Del Mastro, I think that's how you say his last name, that is seen as a very good potential blue liner for them. And then, of course, you have other names like Seth Jones that is expected to get a lot of minutes. There are other young blue liners that are going to be expected to at least contribute in the short term for this team, maybe even long term. And this is where I get excited for Chicago, because they have a lot of young talent that aren't just necessarily one position group or one side where you have a lot of defensemen, a lot of forwards. They have a little bit of both. And you're starting to see more and more of these players get a little bit of that action in the NHL. Just like we talked about with the San Jose Sharks, some of these guys are getting opportunities. Connor Bedard just won the Calder Trophy. And the Hawks are not going to be a playoff team, much like the Sharks are not going to be a playoff team next year. But Chicago feels like they're a little bit more advanced in the rebuild, if you will, if they're able to continue and see some of these younger players take the next step. Hawks fans are probably going to be excited about how next year goes, even if it's a bad year. As long as those young players grow, and if you're looking at the blue line, seeing somebody like this could help make this a good group again. Because remember, Chicago was a very good team for a very long time, and they had a lot of good players all on that roster. And then, of course, you have the Anaheim Ducks shocking the world again as they select Bennett Sanucki, as he is the third overall pick. Not saying that this is anything bad, but it is always a little bit amusing when you see those clips of a player being drafted, particularly in this case, and they look shocked because they weren't expected to go as high as they were. And I don't think Beckett was. Now, I'm not an expert, but I saw a lot of these, these models and where they rank these prospects. He wasn't seen as a guy that was going to be taken with the third overall pick, but still somebody that you're hoping turns into a good storyline, where you have a player that was taken maybe a little bit earlier than a lot of people were expecting him to be, that turns into the player they're saying, yeah, he should have gone third overall. And this is something that we saw last year with Verbeek being the GM. They ended up going out and drafting Carlson instead of Adam Fantilli when he was expected to be the second overall pick. I don't have a problem with this if it lands, but I will say there are two things here. One, if you're going to go out there and do things unconventionally with your picks, you have to make sure they click, because if not, that is a great way to see yourself out of the door for the franchise you're with. And then two, if you feel like you are really trying to get a player, especially one that might not be somebody selected that high in the draft, you can try to trade down. Maybe you're worried about somebody else going out there and getting him, but we heard a lot with Anaheim possibly being confused or just trying to figure out exactly who they wanted to take with third overall. You're telling me they could have moved down just a little bit, still would have got the player you wanted, probably, and then you also would have got additional draft picks for the future, just whatever you wanted out of all of this. So I don't necessarily see this as the end-all be-all, but I do think with Anaheim being a team that hasn't made the playoffs in the next 6 years, if you're going to go the unconventional route, despite the fact they keep adding prospects and keep adding these young names that we're excited about, you don't want to become the next Buffalo Sabres where you're in the middle of a 10-plus year playoff drought and you're struggling to get back to what used to be, because the Ducks for a very long time were a playoff team that could very well go on a deep run and even won the Stanley Cup back in 2007. They were on the verge. Other times, of course, 2015, I don't know if they would have beat the Lightning had they gone there into the Stanley Cup final, but they were on the doorstep of beating Chicago. So, I mean, maybe they could have gone and done that. Anaheim fans have seen other teams in their state perform poorly in the last few years, but they'd also like to see their team do well and maybe get things going with LA and San Jose in the future to heat up that rivalry. And then another thing we're going to be talking about here is Habs fans being ecstatic as they get Ivan Demidov as the 5th overall pick. I believe that's how you say his last name. So he was projected to go even higher in the draft. Some people were talking about, kind of that 2 to 3 range, and he falls to 5th. Montreal fans, are you necessarily sad about this? Probably not, because a lot of people seem to be excited about what his future could be. He's already getting to play professionally in the KHL, and yes, he is under contract for one more season with the KHL junior affiliate that it's got with SK St. Petersburg, however they pronounce it. But I'm not really worried about that a whole lot. 2 years ago, especially with Russian players, I would have been much more shy about them being drafted because you're like, are they going to come over here? I'm not really as bothered by that anymore. And with Montreal getting him, you have yet another piece for this team as they are young and trying to build. We constantly talk about Montreal being that team that's got a lot of young players. They've got guys like Juraj Slavkovsky that are still very, very young, that is coming off of his first 50-point season, and other names that, much like we talked about with some of those other teams, are getting NHL opportunities or have never even logged minutes in the NHL at the moment. So I'm hoping things work out well for them. They have 3 players out of the top 4 point producers this year that were 24 and younger, I believe, at the start of the season. Maybe it was even by the end of the season. So Montreal has some of the pieces, and I got to be honest, like I'll always say with Montreal, they are a team that when they are good, the NHL is better in my opinion. And while I will say that Montreal and Toronto rival each other in terms of the passion of the fan base, there's certain aspects, I guess, with Montreal. If they love a player especially, or they love their team, I don't know, it's like a connection. It's almost like a magical feeling, if you will. So I'm hoping with Demidov here, he can be part of the process to get the Habs turned around, because it's been a minute since they've been relevant. Yes, they are a fun team to watch, but they want to be fun and good, and right now they're just fun and not good. And then my final talking point here is about Utah making their first ever pick, and the pick that they ended up going with has a familiar last name, and that of course is Tej Iginla. And maybe you might know exactly who his dad was. Iginla, 1,300 points, Hall of Fame player. Yeah, you're probably familiar with him. And I think this is kind of interesting because you have the Arizona Coyotes formerly making their first overall pick in a new state. I don't necessarily know how many fans in Utah are going to be like, oh wow, that's a big deal, because they may not know about his dad, because they might be newer fans. But it certainly is fun and it is interesting to see, although I will say with Tej, he's not necessarily going to be his dad. Just because one player ended up having a great career, their son is not going to be a star. Now, I'm not saying that in a bad way, and I'm hoping Tej can be that guy, but at the end of the day, he is his own individual, and he's just trying to find his way in the NHL first and foremost. So whether or not this works out, we can still look back and say that this is part of hockey history, as the Iginla name is attached to Utah, and I'm really hoping this will work out for him, as Utah has been very interesting today, as I think at time of recording this, they ended up getting Sergachev and then Marino. So the blue line is going to be fun to watch out for there. I might talk about that or clip when I found that out when I was looking at the pronunciation for one of the players' names earlier at the end of this video. But yeah, we'll see. Anyway, parting thoughts, obviously this could be a big draft for a variety of reasons. I wish I could go into more coverage. I think one day, if I am able to go and do this full time, I will put a lot more effort into the draft, because I think it is something fun to talk about, even if I typically just talk about the first, 5 or 10 picks in the draft. This year though, you're hoping to see some game-changing drafts from teams like San Jose that had 2 selections in the top 11, and then Chicago, they had 3 picks in the first round. Always hoping that those teams that are at the bottom never have to stay there for too long. I know some people that are more fans of relegation are like, yeah, punish them. I'm not. I want to see every team be able to at least have some positive with some of the negative that they get. because you never know how long your team's going to be good. But what are your thoughts on the first round in the draft this year? Who do you think ended up winning as a team? And what are your surprises from this draft? Anyway, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new. Everybody stay safe. Have a great night. And you love hockey, all right. Goodbye, Brigadiers and Brigadettes. This is your captain signing off. Have a great night.